Great. Thanks a lot, Paul. Jim Thomas is another old colleague. We served together at the Pentagon in the 90s. And again, you have his bio. You see he currently serves as the Vice President for Studies at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, this organization that sounds kind of wonkish and benign, but anybody who is familiar with it knows they're doing some of the best thinking and some of the best strategic planning in Washington. And I got to say, another naval officer reached the rank of lieutenant commander, so we really did stack the decks here. But I got to say, among our generation, really one of the best strategic thinkers and planners, if not the best. You'll note his service at the Department of Defense, where he was intimately involved in strategic planning, the QDR process, and so forth. But he's continued to be a very sage voice in terms of American strategy and military strategy going forward. And again, delighted, Jim, that you could join us and offer your thoughts on this topic. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks for that kind introduction, Randy. And it's good to see you, Deputy Defense Minister Yang. I want to congratulate Mark Stokes on an excellent paper that he's written, which I think really is a contribution to our understanding of the military balance in the Asia-Pacific region. I guess I want to build on Paul Giera's terrific remarks going in. I think there's a little bit of overlap between us, but I think you'll find a lot of commonality. And given the subject matter, perhaps that's a good thing. What I really wanted to do today was three things. First, talk a little bit about the broader nature of the problem that we face and how we might characterize it. And then I wanted to talk a little bit first about the implications for the United States and in particular the U.S. military and how we might think about the changing character of the military challenges that we face. And then I wanted to shift gears and talk a little bit from the perspective of U.S. allies and friends in the region. So I think the place to start is really with a kind of a statement of the obvious, and that is that what we've been witnessing really since the mid-1990s is essentially the steady erosion of the military balance in the Western Pacific. And as Mark really makes clear in his paper, it really goes beyond that, but it's a shift in the balance throughout the entire Indo-Pacific region. What this is leading to, short of war, is in peacetime, perhaps shifting perceptions on the part of the Chinese military and political leadership about their confidence and how they can use military force as a backstop for coercive diplomacy and as an element of their grand strategy. And shifting perceptions amongst other countries in the region, whether they be U.S. allies and longstanding friends or other states in the region in terms of watching what the trend lines may be over the next several decades. More specifically, when it comes to the military balance, I think what we've seen, especially in the past decade, is a very quiet but steady erosion in crisis stability. And this is a wonky term for how we think about the opening aspects of deterrence and how we minimize opportunities or, in fact, incentives for one country or another to use military force. And tied to that, obviously, is deterrence, the ability to prevent war through the show of both capabilities to deny an adversary their objectives, as well as potentially to retaliate or punish them for offensive use of force. What we've seen in terms of the PLA's development of its capabilities, and in particular, as Mark really deepens our collective understanding, focusing on the 2nd Artillery Force, its organization, and its capabilities, is the maturation of an extended range precision-guided strike regime. And if you think back to the early 1980s when Marshal Ogarkov in the Soviet Union talked about the emerging reconnaissance strike complex, really one of its early manifestations in the 21st century is the capability that we see the PLA developing today. it's a very substantial missile force, and as Mark makes clear in his paper, it's not only in terms of varying ranges of ballistic missiles, but it's also a growing cruise missile threat as well, both to land targets as well as ships and maritime targets. They're exploiting interior lines of communication. So whereas the United States has to come from thousands of miles over the horizon, they're able to pivot very quickly on interior lines, and those missiles could be shifted in their targeting. And of course, they enjoy a much deeper magazine. It's easier to reload those launchers. It's easier to pre-position precision-guided munitions than it would be for almost any opposing adversary. What we see today with the PLA, though, is I think only the first manifestation of what is likely to be a proliferated capability, along with weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. We're going to see this capability not only at the high end of conflict, but at the low end as well, as we see even groups today like Hezbollah seeking to acquire guided rockets, artillery, mortars, and missiles. And we certainly see this when we look to the Persian Gulf, and we see some of the capabilities that Iran is starting to develop and field, in addition to the nuclear capability that it appears to seek. What's interesting in the PLA's case is that as we think about the maritime reconnaissance strike complex that the PLA is developing, which is most pronounced when it comes to the forces of the 2nd Artillery, it appears that these capabilities really exceed any reasonable military requirements when it comes to thinking about a China-Taiwan conflict in the Straits or any sort of scenario there. And this really should give pause to some of the other countries in Asia. I think in Mark's paper, I think he perhaps a little subtly really points to this fact, that as you look at these capabilities that are all kind of being developed in the name of what for China appears to be almost a politically correct scenario for defense planning, that it really should give pause to other countries in the region that these capabilities look like they have to do a lot more with others far beyond the Strait. One of the things that's interesting in this competition, or let me point out two things. The first is that we're looking, I think, at the blurring of the extended range precision-guided strike regime and the long-standing nuclear regime, that these appear to be blurring in terms of the delivery systems and in terms of the target sets and in terms essentially of the substitution effects that the 2nd Artillery Force may be thinking about. And again, this may be part of a broader trend in terms of military affairs in the 21st century on a more global basis. The second is, it really strikes me that there's an asymmetry in terms of the competition between the prime antagonists, the PLA and the U.S. military. What we see the PLA doing is emphasizing, in particular, unmanned ballistic and cruise missile forces. But these are standoff weapons. Historically, what the United States has emphasized has been manned penetrating systems. And I think that this is an interesting asymmetry going forward. Certainly, there are huge opportunities in terms of robotics and the ability to use unmanned aircraft in the future and harness the advantages that accrue from endurance and emancipating yourself from the physiological constraints of manned systems. But I think the standoff versus penetrating is an interesting point, and that what the PLA is developing is a capability that is in large ways kind of fire and forget. But it's very good against fixed targets, but it may perform less well than a penetrating system, an aircraft, against mobile targets. And this is important to keep in mind as we think about the competition and where there may be favorable asymmetries or advantages that we can exploit. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. So